Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a sinister collection of paranormal stories for you to listen to. Also, trigger warning, one of these stories is quite graphic and depressing. I've left it towards the end. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My sister was at a bar with her girlfriend who ended up ditching her at the bar for someone else. At this point she is already super drunk, but because she was just ditched by her girlfriend, she decided to take a few more shots. The bartender kicks her out of the bar because she is being sloppy, blackout drunk. It's the dead of winter in Minnesota, and this is before everyone had cell phones, so she starts to walk but it's snowing and it's icy. And all that she has for warmth is a thin coat. She keeps falling and landing in the ditch. Eventually she just laid there and closed her eyes and started falling asleep. She's told me that she was startled awake by someone yelling, "Wake up!" but she didn't see anyone around. Almost blackout drunk and covered in snow, she made it the 2 miles home. She woke up in the entryway of her house soaking wet. I don't believe in supernatural stuff really, but she thinks someone was looking out for her. This happened to me when I was about 11 years old. It was the 90s. I've lived my whole life in El Paso, Texas. The culture is rich in folklore and religious beliefs. Many Hispanic families have stories of the paranormal. One popular legend is that of the Weeping Woman, or La Llorona. The legend of La Llorona, Spanish for Weeping Woman, has been a part of Hispanic culture in the Southwest since the days of the conquistadores. The tall, thin spirit is said to be blessed with natural beauty and long flowing dark hair, wearing a white gown. She roams the rivers and creeks, wailing into the night, searching for children to drag and scream to a watery grave after taking the lives of her own. No one really knows where the legend of La Llorona came from. Though the tales vary from source to source, the one common thread is that she is the spirit of a doomed mother who drowned her children and now spends eternity searching for them in rivers and lakes. One night, just like any other night, I was living in a trailer with my mum and dad. My youngest brother was staying with my aunt this night, and I fell asleep watching Jay Leno as usual, and when I woke up I was on the sofa in my living room. The time was 4 a.m., which illuminated from the stove in the kitchen. The television was off, and normally I had the light on, but this time it was pitch dark. I woke up, and I heard this horrible screaming that was coming far off in the distance. The screaming was coming from a ditch that was a few feet away from my home. I heard it and I thought I was hearing things, and I asked myself, am I dreaming? Then I started to hear the animals outside howling and whimpering. These animals that I speak of are cats and dogs. As the screaming got closer, the animals continued to cry. The screaming was something I have never experienced before or since. It sounded like I was in a big hallway, and the woman was screaming her guts out down the hallway. Then in all the screaming, I started to make out words. These words being said by whoever it was at 4 a.m. screaming their guts out shocked me. The woman kept saying, "Ay, mis hijos," oh, my children, in English. In a huge panic, I quickly got up from the sofa and ran to the kitchen, which was right next to where I was asleep. I flicked on the closet light and turned around, but the screaming didn't stop. In fact, it was only getting louder and closer. At that moment, I questioned my sanity. Was I going crazy or hearing things? Then I thought to myself, this is real, and the animals are responding to it in a negative way. So I did what any other 11-year-old boy would do in a moment like this. I ran to my parents' room. I reached for my mum and shook her awake wildly. She woke up slowly, and to my amazement, the screaming faded away as she woke up. I thought to myself, what the heck's going on? I asked my mum if she heard the screaming. My mum was half asleep and said, "Go back to sleep. It's all in your head. I asked her, pleaded with her to listen, that it was real. My mum quickly said, "You're dreaming, go back to sleep, it'll be okay." By that point, the screaming had faded, a long way away. Like whoever it was screaming knew that an adult was awake. I was terrified. I returned to the living room and quickly turned on the TV, as I left most of the lights on too, and I didn't go back to sleep until the sun came up. I couldn't believe what I heard and witnessed. I was being treated like a crazy person whenever I shared the story. It got so bad that I kept my experience to myself, and to this day I don't care what people think of my experience because I know what I heard. A few years later, it happened to me again, but that's a whole nother story. I'm going to share with you something that happened over 22 years ago. I was visiting my mother in Texas over the summer, and I had to sleep in the living room. Sometimes my little brothers would come in and we'd all sleep on the floor and just talk. Joke around and prank each other as one does. My aunt at the time was fighting breast cancer, and she chose to go home and pass there rather than at the hospital. So we were all kind of just waiting for it to happen. Well, one night, me, Trey, and Jevon are all in the living room, and Trey is sleeping. It's about 1 to 2 a.m., and I hear heavy breathing in the room, and I look up to see if someone is in the doorway leading to the kitchen, but no one's there. I asked Jevon if he heard it, and he said he had. Then we both got really quiet again, and it happened again, almost like someone was taking deep breaths right next to us. I go down to where Trey was sleeping and cover his mouth slightly and tell Jevon to hold his breath, and I can still hear it. All of a sudden it stopped, so I took the time to get up and walk to the kitchen to see if my mum's boyfriend was there, and their door was closed. Not even 5 minutes later the phone rang, and it was my aunt's husband telling my mum that she had passed away a few moments ago. To this day I still think she came by to see everyone before she went. Makes me spooked whenever I think about it, to be honest. About 15 years ago, my sister's family had to relocate from Michigan to Pennsylvania for career reasons. Their new home was actually within a few hours' drive of many American Revolution and Civil War sites of interest. My wife and I would make it a point to take a trip and see them at least every other year, and during our trips, we would always try and take at least a day trip to Gettysburg. Being the site of a major battle, there are plenty of ghost stories to be told, and as such you can find any number of companies offering ghost tours and night walks, and we were probably a little too interested in all things ghostly. Our first trip was great. We got to take the battlefield tour with my sister, as well as enjoy some fun shopping and the usual touristy things. We did not really see or sense anything on the battlefield tour, but there was a moment when we walked on the main street that I definitely caught the smell of gun smoke. It only lasted for a few seconds, so I didn't say anything, until I noticed a confused expression on my sister's face. That's when she looked at me and said, "Gun smoke?" I confirmed it as well, though, as I recall, we were the only two that noticed it at all. There was no demonstration going on at the time. We chose a ghost tour for the night, but nothing more noteworthy happened. It was a fun walk through the town at night though. That was it for our first time there, but our second adventure would prove to be much more eventful. Our second trip, we wanted to stay overnight in Gettysburg so that we could do a late night ghost tour. We also had decided that we were going to stay at a bed and breakfast that was known to be haunted. I believe it was called the Tilly House Inn. There is a very awesome and inspiring backstory of a 15-year-old girl called Tilly who helped out soldiers during the war. The hauntings reported consistently include disembodied footsteps up the main staircase and generally all throughout the site. The voice of a young girl's laughter, as well as an apparition of a young girl. Reports of the sensation of someone sitting at the foot of the bed, as well as the feeling of being watched. And one specific room has been reported to be haunted by a soldier that will walk across the room, through the door to the hallway, down the stairs, and back to the room, finally resting on a chair by the bed that faces the main street of the town. We didn't really do much research into the hauntings before our stay, and only found out specific hauntings after the fact, so my experience there wasn't pre-programmed. During our stay, we took part in a live ghost hunt with a group of people led by a local professional. We were provided equipment similar to what they used in many ghost hunting shows popular at the time, which was cool to us. Aside from some hits on our EKG meter, nothing much happened, but it was a little distracting as some of the other hunters were annoyingly loud and shouting the entire time. I can't blame them though, since that is often how we humans deal with potentially scary things. In any event, it was a fun experience and fun despite the other patrons. Following the ghost hunt, we grabbed some food and headed to our ghost tour location, which started a few buildings down from the Tilly house where we were staying, so it was a convenient choice. The group gathered in a cellar under a restaurant, which was fitted with a dim light and haunted house-style decorations that fit the ambience perfectly. At this point, we could tell that this was a much higher production value than our previous ghost tour from a year prior, and we were definitely on board. Once everyone gathered, they gave us a sort of orientation to discuss the places we would be walking through. Our trajectory would take us through an old park, up a hill that overlooked a school that had been newly built up on a battlefield, and finally concluded at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, specifically a back corner that rested against some woods. During the orientation, I started to notice a few flashes of white towards the back of the room, and could not identify the source's cameras as they were not allowed at that point. Eventually, we were on our way. The first stop on the tour was more informational than anything, and though I found the stories interesting, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Our final stop was the cemetery, but we stopped a few yards away, and our tour guide gave us a brief history about the area of the cemetery where we were going to stop. At the moment, I had a feeling it was going to be a terrifying story to put the tour on the edge and more in the mood for ghosty stuff. I wasn't far off in my guess, as he related a story about the spirit of a young girl called Elizabeth. She, according to the story, was a young girl of around 11 from the Civil War period that fell fatally ill. Her parents were unable to provide medical help, so they had no other alternative than to let nature take its course. This tragically led to a slow and painful death over time. Because of this, as the story goes, Elizabeth has become a vengeful spirit at times and has been known to lure people into the woods, sometimes with tragic results. As the tour guide would say, some nights it's okay to go to the area of the cemetery, other nights it's not. He said that he had a trusted, psychically sensitive friend who he checks with. His friend would call him before the tour, and concerned, and asked if he was planning on taking them to the Elizabeth part of the tour, and would give a stern warning on those nights. Of course, ever the skeptic, I took it with a grain of salt, and simply went along with the ride once he assured us that it was safe on this particular evening. Gathering ourselves, the crowd, a mixture of fear, skepticism, and excitement, we walked up the road to a small clearing inside of the wooded area near the cemetery. It was pretty dark at this point, but we were still pretty much in town, so it wasn't unbearable. When we all arrive, the guide ushers us all to a circle around him and starts to take some deep, slow breaths, sending positive energies out to keep the angry spirits at bay, should she find an interest in our group. I was looking around the surrounding trees and back to the woods as we gathered, when I froze, noticing a white flash of light darting around out from behind the trees. It was around the clearing, yet never came too close to the group. It could have been roughly the size of an 11-year-old girl, which sent shivers down my spine. That's when the tour guide began talking about potential ways Elizabeth may manifest, usually in the form of a white light that will dark around the clearing yet never come close. I regained my breath and kept my experience to myself. After the guide was confident it was safe, he allowed the amoeba of people to do a bit of exploration within the clearing, so long as we did not go into the woods. I, of course, immediately walked into the tree line and looked on into the woods in an attempt to see anything else back there. And sure enough, further out in the trees was another white flash of light. I noped back towards the cluster of people, as even my own high tolerance to ghosty things had found its limit within this creepy situation. Once I rejoined the group, I did take one last glance into the woods and thankfully didn't see anything. One last creepy thing did occur, however, though I am often wondering if it was just my mind playing tricks on me after my previous experience. You see, after my last glance into the woods, I turned back towards our tour guide, who was a few hundred yards ahead of us, and through my peripheral vision swore my wife, or at least another gal in the group, passed behind me and through the gap in the group. As I turned around to go join them, there was literally no one filling the gap, and my wife was on the opposite side of the group talking to my sister. And if it had been another girl in the group, she would have had to move very fast to disappear into the mob like that, though I'm not ruling that opinion out. But it was a creepy way to end the tour for certain. After the tour, we said goodbye to my sister and her husband, and made our way back to the Tilly house to turn in for the night. It was a pretty busy place, and our neighbouring room was kind of loud, but not too annoying so I couldn't complain. The evening continued without incident, and my wife and I talked about our experiences there, and how we really enjoyed the tour guide, discussed our plans for the next day, and went to sleep. Our room was definitely the room haunted by the soldier, though again we had no idea, which is why the final experience for our stay that year in Gettysburg are even more compelling. I am unfortunately a light sleeper, and usually need some kind of ambient noise to be able to fall asleep. Often having a box fan going at night, but our room has no such fan, so the slightest noise would wake me. To top this off, I was already having a bit of anxiety after experiencing the ghost tour. A bit of information on the setup of the room. It was a pretty good sized room, with 2 dressers and a couch. Most of the decor was in a Civil War manner to enhance the experience of staying in such a historic place, with the bed positioned next to the only window in the room, which was to the left as you entered it. There was also a pair of closed doors on the right that could access the neighbouring room when opened. The headboard was up against the wall, so that one side of the bed would be facing the main part of the room, and the other was a few feet away from the window to allow side access to the bed. There was also a rocking chair next to the window and a nightstand on either side. So I was laying in bed, facing the window, as I usually do when sleeping, when I was jolted awake by a sense of a presence approaching the bed. I then heard a very definite creaking of hardwood floorboards, as if someone was walking into the room from the hall. Half asleep and slightly paranoid, I froze in bed for a second, then checked to see if my wife had maybe gotten up to use the bathroom, but she was fast asleep. The disembodied footsteps seemed to continue over to her side, then circle around the foot of the bed and over to mine. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and the left side of my body tingled with energy, as it tends to do when the paranormal is encountered. I felt something pass me by. Then the rocking chair by the window creaked along with the floor, as if something of substance just sat down. Initially, I was avoiding looking in that direction in case I saw something I didn't want to see, but finally, I couldn't help myself and turned towards the chair and window. I stared in awe between the ambient light and the street lamp and the darkness of the room, and I witnessed what I could only describe as the silhouette of a soldier in the chair, facing the window. Though it was very much a silhouette, I could make out the shape of some of its Civil War uniform down to the squared hat. I tried to mumble something like, "Hello there," then turned away and went to bed. Later, I would find that it's a common sensation in your room to witness the same thing, almost as if the remaining energy of a soldier is standing guard for those in the room, playing out the same routine time and time again. I don't know. The next day we left Gettysburg as planned and continued our vacation, and we've been there a handful of times before and since, but that trip has really stuck with me for a while. To start, I live on and off at my dad's farm, located in rural southern Brazil. The farm is located on what used to be a limestone quarry some 30 years ago. A few remnants of that time still remain strewn about the farm, such as an old minecart and its tracks, a huge brick limestone furnacey thing, some overgrown dirt paths where trucks used to drive, and some factory walls and equipment. The nearest town is about a 5-minute drive away and has around 10,000 people in it, consisting mostly of nice country folk. Most of the farm is a big forest area because it has a fazenda de reflorestamiento, meaning we sell trees and plant them again and such. The following events are in chronological order though. I can't pinpoint the exact day and month, but before I moved back here this year, I had spent the first half of 2022 here and moved back to my hometown for the later half of my final year of high school. My mom and my brother lived with me back in our hometown as she was waiting for my brother to finish that year of middle school and for me to finish high school to move to the farm to join my dad and older sister who were already living there full time. It was a cold night in early November of last year when my dad told me he and my sister were awoken by 2 large explosions in the woods behind our house. My dad, having been a gun owner, is well aware of a noise that a weapon can make, and said that this was nowhere near a gunshot and more along the realm of some sort of explosive detonation. The whole house seemed to shake and vibrate, and the windows also shook in a very intense way. Our guard dogs awoken and started barking like crazy in the direction of where the noise came from but didn't move. At first I was quite skeptical of what my father and sister had told me, believing it was nothing more than a tall tale to scare me and my brother, who were just moving into town, and by extension, the farm. A few months later, in early 2023, my mum, my brother and I, as my sister had to go back to her house for a bit, and my dad, travelling for work, were woken up by the same noise and explosion my father and sister had described. I was laying in bed, preparing to fall asleep, when it happened, and it sounded like someone had blown up a gas tank a few meters from the house. The windows shook, and I desperately tried grabbing my phone to record the sound if there was another explosion, but in the pitch darkness of my room and the desperation of knowing what's going on, it made me forget I had left it plugged in at the outlet way across the room from my bed. A second explosion happened, and once again the walls and windows shook. I exited my room, just to find my brother and mum had done the same thing, both standing in the living room. My brother, who is 14, was visibly frightened by what had just happened and was telling everyone to be quiet just in case whatever had made the explosion could hear us. Me being the paranormal fan, I really wanted to look out the back window to see what made the noise, but instead did what I thought would be the safest option and closed every window and curtain in the house that was still open. I didn't want to see what made the noise, my mind trailing off into stories of aliens and skinwalkers and such, and I decided that I would be better off not looking than accidentally catching a glimpse of something that was out there. While closing one of the blinds, I did catch a glimpse of one of the guard dogs just sitting at the front of the garden, looking up over the house, as if to something in the tree canopy behind it. It was quite difficult to go back to sleep that night, but nothing more happened that day. Talking to my dad about what I had experienced, he said the explosions we had heard were just the same ones he had heard in November. Nothing weird happened for a while, until one day late at night, my mother was woken up by a very loud jet engine noise. We don't live near any major airports, and planes that do fly over us are usually very high up, so we can't hear them. It seemed to be coming from on top of our house, and only seemed to get louder and louder until it ceased instantly. Curiously enough, no one else was awoken that night. I also had one of those experiences with a loud jet engine noise. It was around 2 a.m, and I was laying down in the living room couch playing Fallout New Vega, doing the Boomer quest line, when I started hearing what I could only describe as a plane flying past our house, but never actually went anywhere, so all you heard was the same noise and it wouldn't stop. I was wearing headphones, so at first I just assumed that it was coming from the game. But when I removed them, I could still hear, and it sounded like it was coming from the top of the house. Freaked out by this, I saved my game, turned off all the lights and went to my room to be safe, or something along those lines, when it suddenly stopped. We've had some other experiences at this farm, like my parents and seemingly our dog seeing a ghost kid run past the house and disappear into the forest. Our neighbors telling us how she and her dad found some sort of Brazilian folklore beast called the corpo seco, which is basically a zombie wandering the forest, along with some other creepy stories from people that have lived around this area longer than I have. Me and some of my family members have had some other paranormal experiences happen to us, but so far, these are the only ones since we've moved here. About 2 years ago, a co-worker took his own life. Shortly after this, I cleaned out his workstation, I boxed up everything, and delegated files to others and turned off his computer. His cubicle sat empty for months, maybe almost a year. One day I needed to see if he had a copy of an invoice or something. I can't remember exactly what, but I thought he might have scanned it and saved it on his desktop. I flick on his computer and was looking for the file. Just as I was about to shut it down again, I heard a scream from downstairs. A lady in our office received an instant message from the computer I was at. Now, I didn't open up Skype or the Teams app on his desktop. I just turned on the computer and looked in documents and desktop for what I was looking for and didn't find it, then shut it down. The instant message she received was weird too. The message didn't have anything in it, just a blank pop-up. No one else received anything from his computer. Lastly, whenever someone leaves our company, I usually reset all passwords, so since this app was attached to his 365 account, it would have asked me to update the password instead of just opening the app. Also, we knew he didn't leave a note before taking his life. Maybe he just wanted to reach out. The story that's about to be told occurred while I was 2 years old in my family's first house on Long Island. My father would always tell me this story as I grew up, and it has taken forever to sink in with me as my first experience with the paranormal. It was during Christmas time during 1998, and I was playing in the basement with my older brother who was 5 years old at the time. We were messing around with a Mickey Mouse toy that crawled when the on and off button was toggled. When this toy is turned on, it shouts, "Hello," in a Mickey Mouse tone, and "Goodbye" when it's turned off. Dinner was ready and my father came into the basement to inform us. He picked and carried me up the stairs as my brother followed us. As we were walking up the stairs, the Mickey Mouse toy said goodbye, but it sounded different. We stopped midway up the stairs and looked at each other. My father questioned my older brother and asked if he had turned the toy off before leaving it, and he claimed he hadn't touched it at all. Neither me or my brother turned off the Mickey Mouse toy, and my dad continued up the stairs to get me settled into my high chair to start eating. During dinner, my dad received a call from our grandpa announcing the death of his sister, my dad's aunt. He hung up the phone and told us the news. My dad sat back down at the table after a few bites and decided to check the battery pack for the Mickey Mouse toy that was abandoned by my brother. He crept back down the stairs, approached the toy, and ripped off the Velcro back and glanced at the battery switch. The switch was still toggled on. My dad instantly felt a rush of goosebumps. Until this day, I genuinely believe my great aunt sent us a message through our Mickey Mouse crawling toy about her passing. When I started dating my wife, I was 15, and her stepdad gave me this rock that had a dragon carved into it. It was cool actually, and it was heavy. I took it home and placed it in my room inside my entertainment center. As time went by, it became difficult to get a good night's sleep. I would wake up constantly and have trouble getting back to sleep. I also had increasingly suicidal thoughts. I began withdrawing myself from my family. One day I was watching my small nephew, and I was sitting outside on the phone. I was peering through the window to keep an eye on my nephew, who was sleeping on the couch, when all of a sudden, a small dark shadow about 4 feet tall went from one room into my room. I immediately got chills and was honestly too afraid to go back inside. Another time I was sleeping in my room, and I woke up to the same shadow standing over me, and I couldn't move or say anything. The moment I started praying, it descended into my room, and I was able to move again. I got up and ran out of the room and fell asleep on the couch. One day I was watching a program about hauntings, and they had mentioned how a demon attached itself to a doll. That's when it clicked on me that everything started happening once I got that rock dragon from my girlfriend's stepdad. I opened my entertainment center, but it was gone. I looked everywhere for it and never found it again. But since it disappeared, everything stopped. I was myself again, and no more shadow people or night terrors. There is only one small note, and I'm unsure if it's related, but during this time I developed type 2 diabetes, and I have always wondered if it had something to do with it. When I was 11, we first moved to California, near the Yosemite area. There were lots of forests and small lakes near where I lived. I moved right around when the summer was ending and school was starting, so I took a bit to get settled and used to everything. Summer rolled around the next year. My family is pushing me to get out the house and do something besides staying inside and playing games all day. There was a lake with lots of dirt paths and such that were easy to explore, so I'd go around there a bit and just walk around, especially this one spot that had a cool little waterfall into a smaller lake from the bigger lake of that area. Well, one of these days I'm walking to the lake and I spot someone by the waterfall. She's a girl around my age with orange hair, freckles, and an accent that I wasn't able to understand at the time. I think it might have been Tennessee. I've always been terrible with names, but I can remember her being a very common one like Alice or Casey or something like that. As a young kid, I never really had crushes on girls. Most of the time, if I was a friend with someone, them being a guy or girl, didn't change much how I interacted with them. And she was definitely the same way, because we immediately got along. I remember us going to the lake and walking around a lot. I talked a lot about living in Washington, what school was like, and video games. Something I can tell went right over her head. She said she was visiting her grandma over the summer at a house down the road from mine. I remember I had asked her number so that I could text her whenever I was planning to go for a walk, and she'd meet me at the end of the driveway of the house she was at. I remember her saying her grandma didn't want her going to my place, which was understandable. I was a stranger to this woman, but Alice didn't want me to come visit the grandma either, which I found a bit weird. I remember my friend Eric, who lived near the lake. We always came by, and he wanted to come walk around, and Alice told me that she'd rather it just be the two of us. Maybe it was because she didn't know him, but she would only come with me on these walks alone. I remember one time we walked out a bit further than usual on one of these dirt paths. This one was a bit awkward because of a hidden incline on this hill, and she'd have to pull me up for us to walk around and jump down when we walked back. Well, cut to near the end of summer, and she's still hanging out with me, even meeting me at the end of my driveway. I remember this one time I was having trouble finding my jeans, so I didn't get cut by the bushes we walked past, and told my mum before she went to work to tell Alice that I was going to be a bit late. I'll explain why this is important. On our last day walking around, we went to the rock that overlooked the lake and sat there. I remember she was talking about her family and how much she preferred being there in California than where she was from. Something I don't remember if she told me specifically or not. Well, I said bye to her and that I'd try and meet her at her house before we took off. I never did. I think I was forced to go school shopping that day, so I sent her a text. She didn't seem that upset though. I don't know if I never checked in with her after that or if I had forgotten her, but I never saved her contact. It was an old flip phone my parents had given me at the time when I was young. They didn't have a good texting/calling plan at the time. Cut to a good while later in 2021. Lots of drama is happening in the family, which I won't get into. But I asked my mum about that year being forced to go outside more and if that was her decision or my father's. Spoiler, it was my father's. I brought up how it wasn't that bad and that I had Alice to hang out with, and that sparked a bit of nostalgic happiness that I hadn't felt in a while, thanks to how bad that previous year was for us. Well, my mum said something that made me reevaluate that year on loop. "Oh, that imaginary girl you walked around the lake with?" I immediately thought she was messing with me, but she looked serious, and thought that at the time I asked her to tell Alice I was going to take a while was an imaginary friend, because she claimed she never saw anyone when she went down the driveway. I know I had interacted with this girl. I know I had gone with her to the lake many times, but I never ever thought about how I was the only person to ever see her. Never my friend Eric, or his brother who sometimes went to the lake with me, nor my family, and I never met her grandma. I can't confirm if I even had this girl's number, or if I'd even texted her. It threw me off a good bit, but then I remembered one thing that made me know I was right and she was real. One time in July, when I was walking with Alice to the lake, my grandma had stopped to give me a soda while she was heading to my house to give my dad something. Well, when I next saw my grandma, I brought it up. She didn't know what I was talking about until I mentioned Alice. "Oh yes, I remember. Your dad always brought up how you and some girl would go walk around the lake, and I thought it was cute. Weird that he thought it was a real girl and not one of your imaginary friends." That hit me to my core. There's no way I imagined all of this and still have no idea what she could mean by one of my imaginary friends. If I ever find that old phone, I'm going to try and get to the bottom of this. She has to be real. Otherwise, who have I been imagining this whole time? Back in the early 1990s, I worked trauma scene cleanup. If you don't know exactly what that is, we were the professionals that came in after the crime scene investigators left. We cleaned up crime scenes, unattended deaths, people taking their lives, accidental deaths, and sometimes even murders. As you can imagine, I have been in some pretty horrible situations. A lot of the scenes even made the local and national news coverage. We were on 24-hour call service, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to get calls in the middle of the night for some events. This one evening in particular came in just after 10 p.m. or so. By the time we arrived on scene, it was after 11 p.m. This time my crew consisted of my team leader and me, the supervisor. So it was just the two of us, and we figured we didn't need a third hand, so we handled the call. The sheriff's department released the scene to us. Our job wasn't to clean up the scene, but simply secure the site. We would do this service to a lot of public agencies, as they didn't have the ability to leave resources on site to secure the crime scene in this way. We were used to dealing with it, and most agencies used our services. The scene was in a well-to-do neighborhood, not millionaires, but people who were better than middle class. It was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a 2-story house with a long driveway leading up to it. We parked our truck at the end of the driveway and made our way to the scene. Most of the time, the deputies only told us to secure the scene, sign the papers allowing us onto the property, and they were off. We get up to the house. It was murder-suicide with arson. From what I gathered, the father took the life of his entire family, wife and kids, and that set the house ablaze, and ended up taking his own life in the living room. Of course, when we arrive on scene, the bodies are never still there, but what is left behind is blood, body fluids, and small fragments of brain matter. The coroner doesn't remove every tiny piece, but we're used to that. However, in this case, we were not there to clean anything up, but to secure the scene, which usually involved boarding up the structure, putting some locks on doors that were broken into by the fire department, and sometimes they cut holes in the roof to vent out the fire, or cut holes in the walls in search of hidden flames. As we entered the house, it was still very hot. Most people are unaware how long it takes for a building to cool after a fire. But in contrast with the crisp, cool air outside to the hot, humid smoke filled inside, you begin to sweat a lot, and the dust mask doesn't help. We had a lot of windows to board up, and were used to boarding them up from the inside since it was already damaged, and we would drill screws into the plywood. The reason it's so important to do this is because some sites like these become an attractive scene for kids and teens, and even some adults, who'll break in to see what happened out of morbid curiosity and any valuables left over in the home. We had to chase teens and homeless away, so it's not entirely out of the realm of finding people already snuck inside. As we were in, it was hot, and we're sweating, as in all the fires and utilities are shut off, and we had a mounted generator in our truck that would run extension cords and used battery-powered lanterns. My co-worker and I were in the process of boarding up the back windows that were in the kitchen and dining room, and it was dark and getting darker as we placed each board over an opening and shut out any moonlight coming in. As we were working on the windows of the kitchen, I felt like I saw a shadow behind me. I just thought it was my imagination and didn't say anything to my co-worker. We both heard a loud thud from upstairs that made both of us jump at first. However, we've both been doing this type of work for years at this point, and knew that homes that suffered fire often made loud noises as the water mixed with the intense heat makes the wood expand and pop. So we just assumed it was that. Not a moment later, I saw my co-worker turn from and look behind him. He did it in a way where you would expect someone to be defensive, like expecting someone to confront someone. He turned and looked at me, and I said something like, "I've been seeing shadows." He looked at me with a look of concern and said that he had too. Just then we heard more noises from upstairs. It actually sounded not like the house settling from the fire, but as if someone were upstairs going through things. We used to carry hammer hatchets, and sometimes we would need to cut things, like using an axe and hammer thing. So we also considered it a defensive weapon should we ever need it. We grabbed our lights and headed up, and we were fully expecting to find some teen or burglar ransacking for valuables, and since we are not there in a security type form, we just usually tell people to leave or we'll lock them inside and call the cops. Most of the time the people we've encountered seem more afraid of us, but we were also somewhat afraid of them. We went room to room looking for the intruder, and found nothing other than the signs of the murder that happened upstairs. It's funny, but back then the bloodstains and bloody handprints of the last moments of someone trying to escape with their lives didn't affect me as much as seeing everyday mundane things like kids' toys, or the bathroom where maybe the eldest daughter left all her makeup and hair stuff for the last time that she got ready for that day, or the food left on the table for dinner. I can't explain it, but it's almost like most everyday things affect me, because it was like their life was normal, up until the moment it was taken from them. We headed back downstairs and say to each other that we're letting our minds mess with us, and if you'd have known me back then, I wouldn't be scared easily, as by the time I'd seen too much and been to other people's nightmares almost on a daily basis. As we're working, we both jump and look behind us because we keep seeing shadows. Now, some might think it might have just been cars driving by or something outside, but this wasn't the case, given the position of the house in the cul-de-sac. Not to mention, as we were boarding up the windows downstairs, the shadows we were seeing were coming from areas that the dad took his life in. We were finishing up a window that was next to a garage door that led from the house to the garage when we heard very loud footsteps from above, like if someone was walking really heavy from one side of the house to the other. We both jump up and grab our hatchets and flashlights, and if you'd have seen us, it must have been a funny sight, because we went up and acted like we saw in the movies, like I stood in the upstairs hallway while my coworker cleared the room, and then he stood in the hallway and I cleared the room. In our minds, we were like action heroes, but I'm sure if someone saw us, we must have looked very stupid. Our thinking was that no one was going to get by us without being seen. Again, we searched everywhere, under beds, in closets, heck, even in the showers. Nothing, and no one. We tell ourselves it's our minds playing tricks on us. We go back downstairs to try and finish the rest of the windows and doors. We still jump because we keep seeing the shadows. Just as we're about done with the windows downstairs and bolting up the back door, we once again heard a loud bang, like something really big and heavy fell over. It was so big that we felt it shake the house. We once again marched upstairs, this time not expecting to find anyone, but if something had collapsed, we needed to either put caution tape or try and secure it. We went upstairs and found nothing. Everything was the same. We couldn't explain the loud boom. The thing is, the majority of the fire damage was downstairs. The upstairs did have extensive smoke damage, but what I assume is that the dad of the house poured gasoline downstairs and then started the fire, and then took his life. So the majority of the fire was where we were working and not upstairs. We decided at that point that our job was complete. The only thing left to do was close the front door, and since the fire department used an entry tool to bust the front door open, it wouldn't lock on its own. So in cases like that, we drill a latch in like you would put on a gate, and padlock it. I was drilling in the latch as my coworker was putting all our tools in the truck. As he came back up to me as I was putting in the last screw, we closed the door and put the lock on, and just from the inside we heard and felt bang, bang, bang. Someone or something was pounding on the door from the inside. I jumped back and turned to look at my coworker who was running to the truck and is starting the ignition. I see he's already pulling out of the driveway, so I start to run with the drill and keys in hand, and I'm calling out to him to wait. Then I finally jump into the truck, and he's leaving that neighborhood quickly. We get on a major street heading for the freeway, and I suddenly remember the back of the truck is open. I tell him to pull over to let me close it. He said screw that, and that he isn't pulling over until we get back to the shop. I finally managed to make him stop. I get out and close the back of the truck, and ask him to let me drive. We never went back to the site after that. We told the story a few times to other co-workers and friends, but we would get funny looks and people trying to play it down, as if we let our imaginations get away with us. I've always felt something was really bad in that house, and whatever it was, it didn't like us there. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. A huge thank you, as always, to my members and patrons whose names you can see on screen. Thank you so much for your continued support and contributions that really makes a difference with running the channel. If you'd like to watch more content, they can be found on screen now. Until next time, stay awesome